The part I wanted to mention is the way that Lady Philosophy gets us to look at things from God's point of view in terms of this theory of like the hierarchy of different forms of knowledge. It's such a
Yeah.
beautiful argument when you realize where she's going with it. Can you go through that particular part of it for the listeners?
Yeah, I mean it is, as you know, it's very abstract and it's difficult. And I think part of the difficulty is that it runs against certain kinds of modern assumptions. So here's kind of what I mean. So the key to Lady Philosophy's point there is that the to know something um, is to represent it to oneself in some way or other, but the the sort of representation that counts as knowledge is different for different kinds of knowers.
Hmm.
So human beings are one kind of knower, and there is a way that we represent things accurately to ourselves. And if we get things right, if we're thinking about things as they are, then we're said to have the truth, the true belief, or knowledge if we have the right sorts of reasons.
Right. If I can just jump in, like
Yeah,
the
sorry.
line that
Yeah,
she says that is so kind of mind blowing, and it feels like such a Thomistic thing to say is like thing objects are known not according to like the existence of the object, but
yeah,
according to the mode of knowledge used by the knower, and that's just like pff, wow, that's that's
yeah, yeah,
incredible. Yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah.
go
So
on.
so then so so then God's knowledge of things is not. We shouldn't expect it to be like our knowledge of things, not just in the sense that God's a better knower, but that like God just represents things differently to himself than we represent things to ourselves. And so where this matters is that for us, we are in time. The only way that we can represent things is as being in time. Now, if God is eternal and is somehow seeing all of time all at once, does that mean that God uh, sort of sees the sequence of things in time as though, like he say, it's like the mountaintop image. So imagine like a train of cars or a parade or something, and if you're right next to the parade, you're only seeing one little section at a time, one float at a time. If you were standing high enough up and far enough away, you could see the beginning and the ending of the parade all at once, and all the cars. So is God's relationship to eternal relationship to our temporal world like that? And I think what's interesting, what's about Boethius is that that's actually not quite right. I think that God just doesn't represent things temporally, and so it's not as though time is an illusion, but time, uh, knowing things temporarily, is the way that we know them, and knowing things atemporally is the way that God knows them. So, what's the truth about things? Are they temporal or atemporal?
Hmm.
And I don't think there's an answer to that
Hmm.
question. I think that uh, for something to be temporal is for it to be known as temporal by the kind of knower that knows things temporally. And then
Right.
for something to be atemporal is for it to be known by something whose mode of knowledge is atemporal.
Because from God's
Um,
perspective, we know things piecemeal because we experience our lives piecemeal, not all at once.
yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So then, what this sort of opens up is things like, you know, what really fundamentally is the direction of causation? Is it always from the past, from what we would think of as the past into the future? Or could you have lines of causation that, from our perspective, are backward. And one reason I bring up this example in particular is because when we think about the sort of central salvific events of in the life of Christ, they're supposed to be um, you know retroactive to
Right.
to to
Right.
those in the past, but and then also um, up into to all eternity, wherever God decides to end the world. And so you have this one event from our perspective at a moment in time that is producing effects both in the future from relative to that moment and in the past. Um, how is that possible? One idea is that if the truth about that event is not essentially bound up with the time that it occurred at, and instead its time in history is something that is relative to our mode of knowing, well, then there's really no reason to think, there's no particular mystery about how it could have salvific effects on people past relative to that event.
Right.
So it's absolutely mind blowing. And, it sounds like the stuff of science fiction, but I actually think that there's a really deep theoretical grounding of this, which is that um, if you are thinking of God as the creator of the universe, and if you are thinking of time in call it like a pre-Einsteinian sort of way, where it's not an absolute, but instead it's a measure, it's simply the measure of change, then prior to God creating anything, it doesn't make any sense to talk about there being time at all. Um, Now, if you're thinking of time in an Einsteinian way as like something, then it still doesn't make sense for God to be in time. So if you're thinking of God as able to be God, able to have all of the divine life all at once, independent of there being any creation, and so independent of there being any time, well then, if God does, decide to make a world that somehow, which includes time as one of its components, we could say, well, God would know that it is a temporal world. Like would know that it's experienced sequentially by the kinds of things like us that can experience the world that they're a part of. So he would know that it's a temporal world, but he wouldn't know it temporally. And that just, that seems like, even though it leads to all these mind-bending thoughts, it actually seems to follow from pretty straightforward premises about God being the creative origin
Yeah.
of the entire universe.
Well, by the way, it's interesting that some of these arguments in the later parts are so sophisticated compared to some of the arguments in the earlier parts. And I wonder if part of that is because Lady Philosophy is now not just arguing to try to get Boethius to do something, but she's just answering his questions. At this point, we're in sort of disinterest to somewhat disinterested,
Yeah.
or speculative territory, right? But one of the parts of the argument that I find so elegant is she makes this case for why it's plausible that God can see temporal events, can know temporal events, but without his knowledge being temporal, based on the fact that human beings already have this complex, multi-layered mode of knowledge, and where the higher levels include the lower, but in their own higher manner. So the example would be, I don't know if I'll remember all of the steps, but like, so we have sense perception, and then we have like memory and imagination, I guess, higher than that. And memory and imagination are memory, like memory is knowing sensible things, but it's not knowing things as they are currently being sensed. So it's making use of sense information, but in a different mode. And then like our understanding or our more abstract discursive knowledge of these things is also includes things, and it includes the fact that they are sensible, but it's not in the same mode as sense knowledge. It's just a higher mode of knowledge, but that necessarily comprehends what is in the lower modes of knowledge. But it's not including them as sort of distinctive modes of knowledge within, abstract reasoning or things like that. It's like it's not like it's not like the senses are still operating within that, but it includes what was gained through the senses. And so I guess the term, like the scholastic term for this would be like virtual, like that these things exist virtually, meaning they're not as distinct powers in the higher things, but the lower things, sort of like God possesses like the fullness of all the virtues, but not as distinct like virtues. So they
Yeah.
exist sort of all in one, in a more simple manner in God. So she makes this argument about these different sort of rungs of perception and knowledge, and how the higher comprehends the lower and the lower does not comprehend the higher, and that the higher comprehends the lower not according to the level of the lower, but according to the level of the higher. And so the lower can't be expected to, like, if an animal that only has sense knowledge and maybe memory can't be expected to understand like how we understand sensible things intellectually, for instance.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so therefore, like, it's plausible now we can understand how a being higher than us might have this mode of knowledge that includes everything that we know as things that happen in time that are sensible, but without its mode of knowledge sort of descending into sense knowledge and temporal sequence. So it's just
Yeah,
a
yeah,
beautiful, elegant argument.
it really is, and that's very well said. And it I think it's worth adding to that something that a point on which I think Boethius is often misunderstood, and you haven't misunderstood, but one, when you get this idea of God, knowing everything all at once, past, present, and future, it can suggest, based on some of the language in Book 5, that what God is doing is something very similar to looking at things and like deriving his knowledge from his experience of perceiving things. Because after all, that's how we do it, even though we're only able to do it at one moment at a time. So we look out and we see, the car or whatever, and it's because we're visually in touch with it that we sort of gain the knowledge of the thing that's out there. So maybe God is doing that, but just past, present, and future all at once. That is a mistake, because what that suggests is that God uh, depends on things out there
Right.
for his knowledge of them,
Right.
as though he's just an atemporal perceiver.
Yes.
And that's really not how the view is supposed to work. Instead, part of what it means for God, part of God's peculiar mode of knowledge is that, as Aquinas will put it later, for us, our knowledge is a kind of adequation of our intellect to reality, or conformity of our intellect to the way things are. For God, it's the reverse. It's the conformity of things to God's intellect. So God's uh, the original sort of act of understanding of God, that whereby He knows everything there is to know, is this um, act that occurs in some sense before God makes anything, which is His grand plan for the universe. This comes out in Book 4. This idea that God purposes to make a world and thinks it up and thinks about the kinds of natures he wants to be in that world, the kinds of characteristic acts of those natures, and sort of puts them all together and creates. But his knowledge of creation is not, again, it's not passive, it's active. And it's all at once, because he planned it all prior to making anything. And that I think is important, because Boethius is sometimes accused of having this view about knowledge, divine knowledge, that is defective, because on the classical tradition, God is pure actuality, so he can't be dependent on anything outside of himself for having any of the perfections that he has. So if God has perfect knowledge of all things, but if that knowledge that he has is dependent on having somehow perceived correctly the way things are out there, then that perfection in God, the perfection of knowledge, would be a perfection actualized by the state of affairs of things in the world at large, and and so then God would not be pure actuality, or at least would be pure actuality, but dependent on creatures, which is perverse. And so we need to find a way to describe God's perfect knowledge in a way that doesn't compromise his being pure potency,
Right.
as being purely independent, totally independent of the created order. And that's the way Boethius does it. And the couple of lines that are sort of teasing with this analogy, this vision analogy, if they're not read in the broader context of these distinct modes of knowing, they can start to suggest that God is perceiving the beginning to the end all at once, the way that we perceive the present, and
Right.
and that's where the analogy is no longer analogous, but some of the lines can suggest that the analogy continues there.
Interesting. Interesting.